Okay, now let's just get these things shooting at each other. Before we do that, we need to add some crosshair. Okay, lots of different ways we can do this. Let's just go to the canvas panel. I'm just going to add an image. You could have, you could have a nice one you've made. I'm just going to use multiple images. Okay. So, where are you at? Where'd I put you? Huge. Five by five. It's anchored in the center of the screen. There it is. Let's maybe 20 maybe. Position. Three and a half. 2.5 by 2.5. No. There we go. Let's duplicate. We'll just add in some images on there, blank images. Okay. That is way too close together. Well, I mean, it depends on what sort of thing look you're going for. They're way too small, I think. Let's do a new editor window. Yeah. Well, let's just space them out a little bit. Okay. Let's see. Then let's duplicate that. All right. Let's see how that looks. Oh, let me fix that. There. That works. Let's see what we got. Now let's do our shooting logic. So to do our shooting logic, we're going to need a projectile. Make it an actor. Let's call it capture the flag projectile. CF projectile. Open it up. Let's see here. We're going to need to replicate it. We don't need to replicate movement, but we do need to add a movement projectile movement. There we go. Let's see. Talk about gravity. Turn that down to 0. Now, the movement speed. Just for debugging, we're going to make it nice and slow. So let's just only move it at 100 for the initial and max. Okay. Let's add a collision sphere. Let's make it the root. We'll leave it big for debugging, but we need to turn off hidden in game so we could see it for debugging. All right. What else do we need to do to this thing? Let's generate hit events. I think we can turn off overlap events. Those are always expensive for anything that moves. Collision. We actually want to block. Let's block all. And we want to do custom. Let's do custom. We're going to block all. Except for, let's see. We'll keep it like this for right now. And then let's add a collision type, because you see how you have object type here? We want to have a custom one. We want to have a custom one just for this thing. Go into project settings, go into collision, go into object channels, new object channel. We're going to call it projectile. We're going to tell it to block. All right. We're going to go into our character. And so this thing, this collision sphere here, we want to adjust its collision. And we want to customize. For the projectile, we want to ignore it. Object upon, that might cause us an issue. We'll get to that in a minute. But the mesh here, it's collision, set to block. So we should be good there. Whenever you add a new, there, let me get there. Whenever you add a new projectile, it can cause some of the presets to lie. And by that means, like no collision, well, then we won't have to mess with that. Block all, we should be good. Projectiles blocking, but overlap all, you notice our projectile is blocking. So just make sure overlap all is still overlap all. Block all will still be block. Overlap all dynamic. Just ignore only pawn. Okay. Overlap only pawn. Like that's okay. Pawn. I think that's going to work for what we're doing. I'm not 100%. Character mesh. We want that to block. Okay. I think that'll work. Now let's start shooting these things. So we got to add an input, and how we figure that out. So in our character, they got this default input mapping. Takes this jump, move, all this junk. Let's find one of them. Jump's going to be the most similar. We're going to do a shoot. Let's duplicate. Say shoot. All right. I don't think we need to modify anything in here. Go back. Add a new mapping. Shoot. Oh, they had one from the first person. Okay, that's fine. We're going to use our third person one that we made. And for our input action, let's tell it to be the mouse. Left mouse button. Back to our character. Okay. Get to the shoot. Okay, that was the first person one. There's our third person one. Okay, next. We want to go with started. Okay, so when we click the shoot button, we're gonna need to go onto the server for clients. So what we need to do is add a custom event. Call it shoot, and we'll call it server shoot. And on here, it needs to be run on server. We're gonna set it to reliable. Now, normally, something you have a direct input on, you would never set to reliable because it would overload the system. But since I'm assuming you're eventually gonna hook up like a projectile ammunition, you're limited by the number of ammunition you can do. However, if you left this as is and didn't use ammunition and tied it directly, what you could do is you could get people with macros that'll make their mouse button fire a gazillion times. And if you're sending a gazillion servers that are reliable server RPCs like we're about to do, they could crash your game. Keep that in mind as you further develop your game. We're going to do all of our shoot logic from the first person's perspective. So let's get the FPS gun. If you were, once again, doing a complete weapon system, you would have particle effects that would fire from the third person that only the other client saw, not the owning client. You would do the same for the first person stuff. You would keep it separate, kind of like the only would do that with effects, so it would appear that a projectile came out of the client, but it was really the first person, or vice versa. Because you got to eventually decide, is the bullet actually going to start on the server from the client, or from the client's perspective, the first person shooter, or from the third person? I would argue that you should do it from the first person because they're going to notice. Whereas if you're shooting at some guy several feet away, it's not going to be as noticeable, especially if you have the first person and third person guns lined up very closely. So I think the actual player would notice the issue first. So that's why I'm going to drive the logic from the shooter themselves, from their first person weapon. Okay, we need to pass through some vectors, so let's do that. We need the camera location. forward vector. That's, you know, what direction it's pointing. We need our muzzle's location. So for our FPS gun, we're going to get the world location. We're going to get the forward vector. And before I forget, we were doing collisions earlier. We're about ready to do a line trace. And it's going to be on a visibility line trace. And we want to make sure that the character receives that. So let's go to the character mesh. Go to his collision. Set this to custom. And we don't want to ignore, we want to actually block visibility. So that's on the mesh, third person mesh itself. We're blocking visibility for our line trace. If you didn't do this, it would look like your projectiles aren't hitting the character in the spot that you aimed. So it's pretty important. You can use your own, you know, traces and stuff like that if you want. But for right now, that's what we're going to use, just visibility trace. So when you run it on the server, you need to actually call it on the client here. So we got our camera. And I got the FPS gun. I don't want that. I want the FPS gun. I did it again. FPS camera. World location, the forward vector. Camera location. Forward vector. And then of our FPS gun, I'm going to get socket location of the muzzle. Promote that to a variable. Call it muzzle name. I'll show you where I got that in just a second. Do it on the started. This is a new input system. I've only used it a few times. Okay, and I said I'd show you where I found that. So if you go to the gun, let's see, where are we at? All right, we open up the gun. And you can see in the right-hand corner here, we have these sockets the artist has put in there, and his spelling is Muzzle with a capital M. That's where we got this. So if you change the weapon, you got to make sure that it has a socket, and you can add sockets. I believe you can just do it like this right up here. I'm not 100%. I haven't done that in a while, but you can just add a socket if there's not one there, and we'll be able to get that location, or if you need to move it out or whatever else you need to do.